Maine last fall. She is now an assistant professor of geology at Colby College, and she will be speaking to us today about dust, ash, and climate, tracing sources and impacts in the subarctic Pacific Ocean. So as soon as that is loaded, we will get started.
Yeah, 13, 2 years ago. It does. It's just incredible. 5. Yeah, it's 20. It does. Oh. That's scary. A couple of times now, I had kids who I had their parents in class. That's scary.
Success. Okay. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be back. You see so many familiar and also new faces here at CCI. So as Dan said, I graduated from here in 2013, and I worked with Carl Kreutz for my PhD in Earth and Climate Sciences. And today I'm going to talk about some recent work that I've had the privilege to be part of in the North Pacific, working primarily with Eric Osterberg's group at Dartmouth. And so I need to acknowledge my many co-authors on this work, including primarily David Poloshenski, who is an honors thesis student at Dartmouth who worked with Eric and me and finished his thesis over this last summer, and also Karen Stamiashkin, who's a postdoc at Bigelow Lab for Ocean Sciences. She's done a lot of the remote sensing work that I'll show you today. You'll also see a familiar cast of characters, including many here at Maine. And I'd also like to thank these sources of support. So Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, Dartmouth, Colby, and the National Science Foundation have all supported this work to some extent. So as many of you know, I'm from Maine originally. I grew up on Mount Desert Island in part. And I was able to work at Palmer Station doing some marine ecology work prior to coming here. I started here at the University of Maine in 2007, where I was really lucky to be able to work on the West Antarctic Ice Sheet or Waste Divide Deep Ice Core. Spent lots of time in this honorable building. And from there, I did a postdoc at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory, where I started to get into dust provenance work. And so I've been doing a lot of work with radiogenic isotopes, strontium, neodymium, and lead to trace dust sources. I won't be sharing that today, but I'm happy to talk about it with you some other time. And then over the past 2 years, I was at Dartmouth, working in Eric's group, doing work in the North Pacific on a new ice core for Denali National Park. This is a picture from field work 2 years ago. So my research is largely focused on paleoclimate using ice cores and sediment geochemistry in particular, to try to understand past changes in ocean and atmospheric circulation and how atmospheric nutrient deposition influences ocean ecology. So you could say I haven't made it very far. Started there in MDI, came up to Orono for 5 or 6 years, and here I am in Waterville now. But I'm really happy to be back in Maine. And I look forward to ongoing conversations about climate change and research with many of you. So today I'll be talking about the North Pacific, specifically the way that it's iron limited and the role that atmospheric nutrient deposition can play in stimulating primary production in this region, and some questions about how climate change may be impacting the system. I'll focus on 2 vignettes. This recent paper that is up now on the JGR website, led by David, so looking at Denali Ice Core MSA, or methane sulfonic acid as a proxy for marine primary production. And then some ongoing work looking at the impact of remobilized volcanic ash in stimulating phytoplankton blooms in the North Pacific, and then sort of some next steps from there. All right, so the Northeast Subarctic Pacific this region here, and the Southern Ocean represent the two largest parts of the world's oceans that are limited by iron as a nutrient. And so what you see here is nitrate concentration. So the orange and yellow through orange and red colors represent higher concentrations. And you can see that there are some warm points here. But if you look at this map of chlorophyll, you see that there are not correspondingly high chlorophyll concentrations used as a measure of primary production. And so what this represents is that these regions have sufficient nutrients, macronutrients like phosphate and nitrate to support primary production, but not enough iron, which is a trace nutrient needed for photosynthesis. At the same time, the subarctic Pacific is a very productive ecosystem. And so this region supports about 5 billion annually in the economy of the United States for Alaska alone. And it's particularly susceptible to climate change. Don Winsky has shown that the precipitation is doubling, temperatures are warming quite rapidly in Alaska, and we know that sea ice is being lost quite rapidly from the Bering Sea. And so the overarching question for what I'm talking about today is, how will climate change impact the subarctic Pacific? A paper that came out in 2003 showed that global ocean productivity appears to be declining. This was a comparison of satellite data from between 1971 and 1986 and 1997 and 2002. So this table shows the area and the percent change in primary production using chlorophyll A measurements for these different regions of the world oceans. And so globally, we see about a 6% decline between these time periods. And in the North Pacific, we see one of the higher numbers, so about a 9% decline in primary production. So there are questions about, well, what is driving this? These declines appear to be linked to warming temperatures and increased stratification, reduced wind mixing, and also potentially declining atmospheric dust deposition as a primary source of iron and other micronutrients that are needed for phytoplankton growth. This is a satellite image showing dust plumes coming off of, in particular, the Copper River, which is one of the larger sources of dust into the Gulf of Alaska. This blue line shows the continental slope. And so these dust plumes are making it well offshore in this region. This illustrates one source of atmospheric nutrients. So this brings us to the overarching aims of this work, which are to try to place these trends in primary production into a pre-anthropogenic context to better understand what's driving those declines and how they compare to other sort of naturally driven changes in the system. And then also to assess changes in iron deposition from different sources, trying to look at how climate may be impacting the amounts, magnitude of deposition, and the timing of those fluxes, and also looking at changes or differences in the bioavailability or the iron chemistry of these different nutrient sources to try to understand how they may be changing in the present and how they may change in the future. All right, so this brings us to the first kind of vignette, which is looking at methane sulfonic acid, or MSA, as a proxy for primary production. So again, this is David Poloshinsky's thesis work. So the idea here is that MSA is only produced by phytoplankton. It's an oxidation product of dimethyl sulfide, or DMS, and this is the only source of this chemical into the atmosphere. So it's produced by phytoplankton, it comes into the atmosphere, and it's deposited with snow on the glacier surface. MSA has been used as a proxy for other things in the past, and so people have measured it in Antarctica and found linkages to sea ice extent, and also use it as a proxy for the extent of open water in the Amundsen Sea through polynya circulation. And so it can be complicated to interpret in a place where you have sea ice, where you're looking at the presence, the absence of sea ice in a sea ice dominated system. But here we don't have that complicating effect. So we're sort of lucky in that sense that the aerosol transport pathways into Denali National Park, shown here with this red star, are coming from or blowing over essentially an ice-free area. So that makes our interpretation much simpler. This plot shows the spatial density of where back trajectories intersect with the marine boundary layer to give us some sense of where that MSA might be getting sourced from prior to being deposited on the ice core site. So the core that we're using is a new core from Denali National Park. It's actually on the Mount Hunter Summit saddle shown here. I was not involved in the drilling, so I have to recognize the many people who made this happen, including Seth Campbell, Carl Kreutz, Don Winsky, Eric Osterberg, and Cam Wake. So here are some images showing the stratigraphy of this glacier on the Mount Hunter Summit saddle. This is a high elevation site with flat-lying conformable stratigraphy, a very high snow accumulation rate of about 2 meters of water equivalent per year, and a very low melt rate because of this high elevation and cold temperature regime here. So mean annual temperatures of -18°C. So in spring and summer of 2013, 2 parallel cores were drilled to bedrock, just maybe half a meter apart. And I'm collectively referring to these cores as the Denali Ice Core. We melted these, again, I was not involved in this, at Dartmouth using a continuous melter system with discrete sampling, and we analyzed a whole range of different chemicals, including major ions, trace elements, dust, conductivity, using continuous flow analyses, stable water isotopes, cesium-137, and those were conducted at Dartmouth, Maine, and University of New Hampshire. So I'll be talking today about methane sulfonic acid, which we measure on the ion chromatograph at Dartmouth. This is a plot from one of Eric's recent papers showing the very high resolution in this ice core and how we can date the core seasonally using different parameters. So this shows a 3-year interval here from 2000 to 2003, looking at oxygen isotopes where we see a distinct trough in the wintertime, and then magnesium and dust particles, particle concentration, where we see a spring peak. This is Asian dust coming across the Pacific. Then we see a summer ammonium peak, and then finally a fall MSA peak. So that's kind of the typical seasonality of these different chemicals. We see really high fidelity between the 2 cores, so that provides big confidence in the data. So this plot shows sulfate concentrations and nitrate between the 2 cores, and you can see that these are very reproducible in terms of magnitude and timing. All right, so we developed this record of methane sulfonic acid and then used CWIF's satellite imagery, chlorophyll data, to see, first of all, is there a relationship? So what these plots show is the spatial correlation coefficient between each pixel in the ocean, representing the chlorophyll concentration over this interval, which is 1997 to 2010, and MSA in the ice core shown here. And so we're looking at those correlations on a monthly basis here and on an annual basis here. So what we see with the monthly data is that both data sets show strong seasonal variation, as we would expect. So the MSA is indeed representing the sort of summer seasonality that we would expect if it's representing that bloom, that summer bloom. And what we see in the annual correlation plot is this zone of significant correlation offshore, which is highlighted in this box. And the black dots represent 95% confidence. And so we see that MSA is correlated interannually with chlorophyll in this offshore region. We also see these areas of significant negative correlation, but these are not in places where those back trajectories intersected the boundary layer, and so we don't think that they really are relevant to the ice core interpretation. This is a time series showing the MSA on a logarithmic scale in red and chlorophyll in black. This is the monthly data, and in the middle here is the annual data. And so you can see the correlation coefficients and p-values for those 2 data sets. So in general, we see a fairly strong and robust relationship between those 2. In the bottom is sulfate concentrations measured in the ice core, with these 2 peaks highlighted, peak 1 and peak 2. And we think that those are playing a specific role in stimulating phytoplankton growth, which I'll show you momentarily, and potentially causing some discrepancies between these two records. So let me zoom in on that. So in 2009, there was an eruption of Mount Redoubt, which deposited a large amount of ash in Cook Inlet, shown here. And so you can see the time series of chlorophyll in Cook Inlet, shown in the solid line with this very large peak in chlorophyll in spring of 2009. But we don't really see much ash deposition offshore, and we don't really see any increase in chlorophyll in our offshore site. So that's shown by the dashed line. During this period of time, there were several storms that blew over Cook Inlet directly into Mount Hunter, shown with back trajectories here and here. And these were May 28th and May 31st of 2009. And so we see a really high, as I showed here, high MSA concentrations there that seem to be driven by that localized flume. Conversely, we don't always see every bloom. So this is an example of conditions that led to an anomalous bloom offshore, which you see here. This is the chlorophyll anomaly. So we see positive values in our offshore box, and we might expect to see that in the ice core record. But at the same time, there was relatively high sea level pressure in the Gulf of Alaska with offshore winds, and the back trajectories into the Denali site are actually coming from the west, and so we don't get deposition from that event. And so the main points here are that we do think that the ice core is conservatively recording MSA, and that's largely due to the high snow accumulation and cold temperatures, the lack of melt, so we have a very high resolution record. We see these correlations on a monthly and annual basis, but we're also not capturing every single event. So we think that on an interannual basis, this is probably a robust proxy for primary production that we can extend into the past to try to look at changes in phytoplankton productivity into the past 1,200 years or so. So I'm also interested in atmospheric nutrient deposition and the role that may play, and that changes in nutrients may play in stimulating or not production in this region. So there are several main sources of atmospheric nutrients. One being volcanic eruptions. This is the 2008 eruption of Mount Kasatochi. You can see the ash plume, which traveled over the Gulf of Alaska and stimulated a pretty well-published phytoplankton bloom in this region. So those are intermittent, and there's probably not much of a relationship with climate, but they certainly do have an impact. And then we're also interested in looking at dust from Alaskan river valleys and dust that comes across from Asia, which really dominates our interannual dust variability in the Alaska range. And iron availability, the geochemistry of that iron can vary by orders of magnitude between these sources. And so understanding the inputs, the geochemistry, and the actual impacts on phytoplankton is pretty important for understanding how these sources may change in response to climate warming and precipitation change. But there's one other source of atmospheric nutrients, which is the remobilization of volcanic ash that was previously deposited on a volcanic slope. And so a colleague of mine, Verity Flower, basically was able to find in just the last year and a half or so, using multi-angle imaging spectroradiometer or MISR satellite imagery, that she could distinguish between erupted ash plumes and remobilized plumes. And she found 19 different remobilized ash plumes just from Kamchatka over the last 15 years or so. This is an image showing a remobilized plume from Shivelich in 2016 and an erupted plume from Karinsky, 2007. So the height scales are in kilometers. These are the same, going from 0 to 3 in red. So you see in general that the remobilized plumes are much lower. We're looking at about 0 to a kilometer or so plume height compared to the erupted plumes, which are closer to 2 to 3 kilometers. There are also differences in the microphysical properties of these plumes, and so she was able to measure multiple things using the MISR satellite imagery to distinguish these events. So we thought, well, maybe these remobilized plumes could serve as another source of atmospheric nutrients, such as iron. And so, so far we just have Verity's data from Kamchatka, And we looked at 5 of these different events in order to see if there was some sort of surface chlorophyll response to the ash deposition. And also, one of the important aspects of this is that these plumes tend to occur primarily in the summertime, as that previously deposited ash has a chance to dry out as temperatures warm. And so the relative timing is actually coinciding with the summer bloom in a way that volcanic eruptions are very unpredictable in terms of timing. There's not going to be a seasonality there. All right, so this is some imagery of phytoplankton anomalies, chlorophyll anomalies for this Slavonic eruption in 2015. So here's our study site on the eastern shore of Kamchatka. Here's the anomaly in phytoplankton on the day of the eruption. This is the same, a little bit more blown in. You can actually see where the data have been blocked out from the ash plume itself. So we're using level 3 satellite data, which has been processed to try to remove any potential complicating factors of the ash being seen as chlorophyll. But that's certainly something that we need to be able to rule out. And then the lower plots show chlorophyll concentrations the day before, the day of, and the day after that remobilized ash plume. All right, so we did this type of analysis for these 5 events. Here are the 4 other events. And in general, we see chlorophyll anomalies in the week following each of these remobilized ash plumes relative to the time series mean of 2003 to 2016. This box just shows the Maine region around the volcano here, but we see anomalous chlorophyll concentrations in varying places, probably as a result of blooms being advected along the coast. So in all but 4, or in 4 out of 5 of these events, these anomalies were 1 standard deviation above that long-term mean. This July 2016 event was not significant at that level. So overall, we've identified these events. Verity has been able to identify them. We're looking at the frequency, the timing of these remobilized ash events. So we want to extend this analysis into the Aleutians and into the Gulf of Alaska as well. We think that these may serve as a previously unrecognized source of micronutrients and that they may be important given the seasonal timing. And so ongoing work is aimed at understanding how they may be impacting the marine ecosystem and whether the timing and magnitude of these events may change in response to climate change. So next steps are to kind of combine these 2 pieces of the story. So to leverage the multi-proxy capability of the ice core to look not just at MSA, but at dust and volcanic deposition over the last 1,200 years. So we want to extend these records back to 800 years CE, and then assess the relative impact on production of these different micronutrient sources directly using biological culturing experiments, as well as the satellite observations. And then we'll be doing a range of geochemical analyses to try to get a better sense of what is really driving growth, what determines that bioavailability. And so finally, the big picture is that we're interested in determining the sensitivity of these different terrestrial micronutrient sources to climate change. So we have a proposal pending to look at that. So that's kind of where my research is going, in addition to the dust provenance work that I'm doing. And I'm really happy to get ideas and questions. Thank you.
Can you talk a little more about the remobilization, how that happened?
I don't know if I can. I'm not sure that anybody has been there, certainly not in Kamchatka, to observe them. There have been other remobilized ash events that have been observed in Alaska, and certainly the Alaska Volcano Observatory probably has more information about how they operate, but I haven't had a chance to dig into that. Peter?
As you know, the Colby carries a huge amount of fluvial sediment compared to the amount of dust, have volumetric idea of the relative amount.
You're talking about the rivers that are draining to the Gulf of Alaska?
Yeah, particularly Colby.
Mm-hmm. So John Crusius, who published that paper where I showed that figure from that paper, I think they did in that paper calculate the relative contributions. I think the main, I think the river itself is of course delivering more sediment, but I think the main point was that the dust is getting farther off the continental shelf. So the delivery is a little bit different. Certainly there are oceanographic factors that are carrying sediment up the coast of Alaska and these mesoscale eddies that are certainly transporting nutrients and need to be considered as well. Yeah.
So I was wondering, like, if this has come up throughout your work, or if there's any implications for like artificial iron fertilization experiments, because these remobilization and kind of volcanic events kind of act as natural experiments for how primary production, or say, like carbon burial might be affected naturally. So what about the geoengineering and human aspect to that? Like, have you thought about that at all?
Well, it's certainly a controversial idea. There have been a number of iron fertilization experiments done throughout different parts of the world, but certainly in the North Pacific, there have been several that have shown certainly the iron limitation of the system. I think people, the whole idea of actually, fertilizing a bloom and then that leading to measurable carbon export below the bound, the mixed layer depth is a bit dodgy. Like it is not likely to be successful at sequestering a lot of carbon, I don't think. And there are other potential ecosystem consequences that people would argue are not worth trying out. But certainly it's an idea that's out there. Yeah.
Thank you. This is really interesting work and nicely holistic and complex. I'm wondering, and you have to excuse my ignorance, if in the long term you could mix any of this data having to do with nutrients with the effects of acidification and how that might also influence productivity, if that's something that's on your radar, or if you think it's relevant.
I think it probably is relevant, particularly for coccoliths and then foraminifera as a grazer. I'm collaborating with marine biologists who certainly have more expertise in that realm. But it's something I'm thinking about, and I'm not really sure, besides maybe cruise data, how you would try to look at those changes. But yeah, definitely worth studying. George?
And if I understood the slide properly, the one you had where you were showing the chlorophyll response to remobilization suggested that it was about a one-day effect.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's true, then it seems likely that these kinds of events could be driving a huge amount of ocean productivity.
You're saying if it's only a single day that it may not be that significant?
Even if in a setting right next to a large source and it's there, and one day later there's no effect anymore, that reveals a lot about the temporal aspect of this whole process, and whether it's a fertilization experiment that somebody does or a natural event like this. It sounds to me every time I heard about it like it's a very quick, short-lived response that seems difficult to interpret as a atmosphere changing event.
Yeah, and one of the complicating factors along those lines that other people have shown is that nutrients deposited in the surface ocean rapidly sink out of the surface ocean, and so there's actually this important recycling process from deeper depths up into the surface layers that is also bringing nutrients. But the one-to-one changes in atmospheric dust to primary production may not be as important as some of these other oceanographic changes. Certainly something we'll have to contend with.
Thank you again.
All right, thank you.
Okay, so just a minute, we're going to move the posters over. We want to get everybody in the back for the big group photograph at 12:30. Lunch will be here, 1 o'clock awards, and then we have a final short session after that. So don't go away.
Thank you.
Yeah.